So, by quick show of hands, who here likes statistics or finds statistics exciting? It's actually probably the best I've ever seen. Luckily for the rest of you, I do. Most people don't. Research can often be a little bit dry. The point of this presentation is really to take some insights that we have from work that's been done in the academic community, by governments, some of it coming from political actors and political parties, and kind of distill that and pull out the salient things about, okay, if we have this issue of declining voter turnout, low youth participation, what will actually get people out to vote? What works, what doesn't? This is voter turnout in federal elections in Canada for the last 50 years. All you really need to see is it's been dropping. It used to be pretty consistently in the mid to high 70s, and it's gone to 61% in the last election. This is something you see in different provinces in different countries. That's voter turnout in BC Provincial elections. It's a little bit lower consistently than federal. It's doing the same consistent kind of decline. Here's the interesting part. So this is youth turnout. The numbers I used are for federal. You can see the same thing in any province. The primary driver of declining voter turnout is low youth participation. So back in the 1960s, in the first election they were eligible for, roughly 2/3 of young people would turn out. It was a little bit below their parents or their grandparents, but it was a very high level. And in the last few decades, we've seen that drop really, really sharply, and it's at the point where roughly 1/3 of voters will cast a ballot when they first become eligible. The gray bar is people over the age of 25, and as you can see, the overwhelming majority of them are accurately registered before the election. For the 18 to 24 group, that rate is much, much lower. It's sitting in the 60s, and so that means, roughly 1/3 of young voters aren't on the list. They aren't getting communications from Elections BC. They aren't ready to vote in that sense. And that sort of lack of preparation, that low rate of registration, shows up in turnout as well. So you see that voter turnout is significantly lower, again, among the 18 to 24 group. And what's really interesting is when you think about this sort of in a larger context, what is this phenomenon? What's driving this? What's causing it? And I often talk about it as it's either a virtuous or vicious cycle. It's something that reinforces itself. Because we know two things. One is that voting's a habit, and it's one that gets formed fairly early. So there's some researchers, one of them from Vancouver, Richard Johnston, who put something forward called the rule of two. And it means if you vote in the first two elections when you're eligible, it looks like people tend to fall into a pattern. And they follow through with that, and they tend to stay on that track of voting consistently in elections throughout their lives. For people who don't vote in those first two elections when they become eligible, it's much, much more difficult to sort of nudge them into that behavior afterwards. They're much more likely to not vote continually over the rest of their lives. And the second interesting thing is that voting is contagious. So if you go to someone, knock on their door, mobilize them, motivate them to get out during the election, their housemate or roommate actually has a 60% higher chance of turning out as well. So it's really important to think about this as kind of a social phenomenon. The challenge you have with young voters then is that habit's not being formed, and if you're not motivating young people to vote initially, that spills over within their entire social circle. So why is this happening? We talked a bit about, Keith mentioned attitudinal factors. And so one common explanation, I decided to pick on Lawrence Martin from the Globe and Mail for this one, is that youth are lazy, they don't care, they don't appreciate democracy, they wallow in their vanities and entitlements, to use his words. And it's a very compelling, common kids these days kind of description, and it's absolutely wrong. So by any reliable measure you look at, youth are no more cynical about government, about parliament, about democracy, about any of these things than their parents or their grandparents' generations. There's no actual evidence for that kind of attitude gap. From the last federal election, you had a room full of people that represented the population of youth. So the dark gray are the ones who voted, light gray are the ones who didn't vote. Again, it's roughly 40% for turnout. So that's what happens if you look at actual turnout numbers. If you run a survey, which consistently gets done during elections, you find something very interesting. Turnout's about 75 to 80% among youth on surveys, which means you have these people who lied. And my argument is that's a very good thing. Lying in this case is a wonderful thing because you see certain things on surveys that people consistently lie about. It's called a social desirability bias. But really it means that you're embarrassed about something and you describe yourself in a way that makes you look better. This goes for everything from when there's surveys about dating in people's sex lives. They consistently describe themselves as more active than they are. Religious people consistently say they go to church more often than they actually do. And voter turnout is always higher on surveys. The hopeful thing about that is that means there's a significant part of the youth population who don't vote, but feel embarrassed enough about it to lie to a complete stranger on the phone or when doing an internet survey. And so my background kind of comes from psychology, and there's a big distinction you kind of make there. It's between attitude and behavior. And the example I always give is this, is I think everyone's been in that situation where, you know, maybe you've got a bottle of water, pop, whatever it is that you've finished, and there's a garbage bin right next to you, and there's a recycling bin where it should go all the way at the other end of the hall. And you really know what you should be doing at this point, but it's kind of far, it's a long walk, you're about to put it in the garbage, and then someone turns the corner, sees you, and in that instant it's decided you're making the long trek all the way down to put it in the bin. And so there was no change in attitude there. And if you look at problems like recycling or things like smoking and getting people to stop smoking, we haven't really seen an attitude change on that in a serious way. People have known that smoking kills them for generations now, quite literally. It's pretty consistently known that recycling is something you should do if you care about the environment. There's no need to raise awareness or educate people. We have to think about, okay, what actually changes a behavior? What will actually get people to stop smoking rather than just to know it's a bad thing? Or what will get people to actually start voting instead of just saying that it is a good thing? And the answer, for the most part, is asking. There's a lot of fascinating work that's been done where you can test interventions on voter turnout the same way you test medications. Say, all right, these people are randomized, they get nothing or placebo kind of thing. The other group gets contact. Say, we'll send them a letter, we'll talk to them, do a phone call, send them email, see what happens. And asking someone in a personal way consistently bumps up turnout by 10 percentage points. Reliably, in different countries, different elections, almost every circumstance. And this isn't just about voting either. So if you look at volunteering rates, 45% of young Canadians who don't volunteer say it's because nobody's asked them. Nobody ever said, would you like to get involved? Nobody approached them with an opportunity. And when you see higher rates among older Canadians, they're more likely to be asked. There's someone who they know in their community, or a stranger who approaches them and asks them to get involved. And that brings us to young independents, which is a term that comes from market research, but is really useful when thinking about younger people. I always like this slide because the photo on the left, I was trying to come up with one of these one day, and we had an intern named Ross, and I'm like, yeah, I need something that shows the lifestyle of people who are in their early 20s, what it's like to be a young independent. And she dug up this one of someone sleeping on a mattress in a completely undecorated room, which I thought caught that sort of transience of it. I'm like, oh, where did you get that? She's like, oh, that's my room. And those are her roommates. So I thought those two photos caught that in a very nice sort of way. And if you look at the population under 25, 28% have changed addresses in the last year. So they're a group that moves constantly. We're also a generation now that gets married later, is less tied into things like what previously would have been labor unions or religious organizations. So a lot of those social bonds and connections that mobilized people and that meant somebody asked you about the election when it was coming aren't there in the same way anymore. And that's a big part of what you need to grapple with when you're trying to mobilize young people to vote now, is it's not necessarily convincing them about democracy being a good thing. It's about having someone who interacts with them in a meaningful way when an election is coming. Some researchers wanted to say, well, let's try a few different messages. What would actually motivate people more? And so all these bars are the comparisons to turnout for a control group. So the first most basic one is just a message about civic duty. So it's your duty to vote. It's actually not statistically significant if we get into that. It doesn't matter a whole lot. The next one is something called the Hawthorne effect. As that just means if you know somebody's watching you, you'll change your behavior. So they did it in a rough kind of way. It's well, we'll send a letter. It's your duty to vote. By the way, you're being studied. Already we're doing a little better. And this is done in the United States where voting records are public. So that means I can go to a county clerk's office and check whether or not someone was registered or voted for anybody, for any citizen. So send a letter, it's your duty to vote, you're being studied. Here's your voting record from the last 2 elections. We'll send you an update after this one's over. Already, you're getting a pretty hefty bump from what was an unimpressive letter to be receiving. I've looked at a copy of it, and not very appealing, not very colorful. But just being confronted with that already encouraged people more. And the last one's, like I said, a little scary. It's your duty to vote, you're being studied. Here's whether or not you voted and everyone on your block in the last election. We're going to send you an update. The researcher who did this, his voicemail apparently filled up within 1 day. He was just flooded with angry calls. So I'm not advocating this specifically as an approach, but it was an 8 percentage point bump in turnout. So it was really significant. That mattered almost as much as someone coming and knocking on your door. And so the takeaway from that isn't that we want Big Brother to be watching you and knowing whether you're voting, but it's that ultimately the way people make these decisions and the way their behaviors happen, the way that those things are facilitated is social. It's about the people around you. It's about even how you feel in front of a stranger, how you feel if your neighbors know whether or not you're voting. And if you really want to motivate somebody to come out for an election, it's not just about coming up with a catchier message. It's not just about coming up with a more effective way to reach them mechanically. It's about finding something that's meaningful to them in a social way.